Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Shock Troopers, originally for arcades, but later released on a variety of other systems, mostly in a virtual console sort of format. What you're seeing here is the Neo Geo version. This is a top-down run-and-gun shoot-'em-up developed by Saurus and published by SNK and originally released in 1997 in arcades, and like I said, it later got re-released on a variety of other systems. But regardless of which system it was released on, you ultimately have to understand that this was originally an arcade game and it plays like one, which is both a good and a bad thing that I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay portions of this. Let's go ahead and delve into the presentation and find out how well this thing holds up after 20 years. Well, as far as visuals go, it holds up remarkably well. They have very detailed sprite work here that is rather stylized and cartoony. Everything is bright and colorful. The enemies go through rather goofy animations as they die, where they'll just spin around several times, their arms will go flying off, that sort of thing, and it just makes everything kind of a joy. There's just something to be said about these classic arcade games that didn't take themselves remotely seriously. Now that said, it's no Metal Slug, so while the graphics are definitely very aesthetically pleasing and they hold up really well, they aren't quite on that tier. The game does also suffer from the slight issue of the hardware not exactly being 100% capable of running the game at its absolute zenith. When a lot of stuff is happening on screen at once, it will slow the frame rate down pretty considerably, but it's never to an unplayable level, so while it is annoying, it's something that most of the time you can kind of work around. Then there's the sound design, which is a bit hit or miss. The sound effects themselves work pretty well for what it is, but they're never really all that impressive, and most of the time they're actually too soft to be heard beneath the music, which is incredibly loud. Luckily, it's a fairly kick-ass soundtrack that really does fit into the high-octane action vibe. It's just that it's also a bit of a product of its time. You do have your rock-inspired stuff in there that works pretty well, but they also tried to be a bit more hip and modern and throw in a bit of hip-hop influence, and that's where it starts to get a bit messy. This means that overall, the soundtrack is solid, it's just that some tracks are a lot better than others. And really the main complaint there is that the music is just too damn loud. It's hard to hear the action of the game when the music is just blasting in your ears. This also means that you won't really hear much of the voice work in this thing. Now, the voice work in this is entirely in Japanese, and it's fairly cheesy. But it's not quite as cheesy as the translated text ends up being, but you do have to keep in mind this was translated in the 90s, so it's gonna be really corny. I mean, one of the characters sits there and says at one point, "Battlefield, this is where I belong." Like I said before, the game doesn't take itself very seriously, and that even extends to the translation and the just dialogue itself. But ultimately, when you bring everything together, the presentation actually ends up holding up rather well, despite being cheesy and definitely a product of its time. But ultimately, what really matter here are the story, or rather lack thereof, and gameplay. Let's face it, this is an arcade game, it's not gonna have much in the way of plot. And the plot in this is that the Bloody Scorpions group has abducted a scientist and his granddaughter in order to coerce the scientist into making the Alpha 301 drug that will turn them into super soldiers so they can take over the world. And so, of course, you play as the various characters of the strike team that is sent in to rescue the scientist and his granddaughter and, of course, save the world from the evil Bloody Scorpions. You do see a couple of cutscenes that are thrown in certain parts of the game in order to advance the plot, but they really don't do much to advance the plot. And when it finally resolves, it's basically, yay, you saved the world. Good job. So there's really not enough in the plot to keep you going, so you turn to the gameplay, and that's where this thing really does shine. This is a single-stick, top-down arcade shoot-'em-up. You run around, you blast the living crap out of anything in your path, you pick up various weapons, and that's kinda it, really. That may seem like I'm oversimplifying things, but I'm really not. This is a very simple game when you get down to it. You just run around, you shoot the bad guys, and then you proceed to the next area, and you keep doing that. Most of the bad guys go down in 1 or 2 hits, but eventually you start running into more powerful enemies that take multiple shots to bring down, mostly things like tanks as well as more powerful dudes running around with jetpacks and such like that. You have infinite ammo for your basic weapon, but you can find various weapon pickups, things like a heavy machine gun, a Vulcan cannon, or a Buster rifle, which is basically a super powerful railgun kind of thing. and maybe even a flamethrower or two. But the thing is that while each of these are going to have different effects when you're actually using them, they also have limited ammunition. Once you've run out of ammunition for that particular weapon, which is not very long after you've picked it up usually, the game throws a lot of enemies at you, you're either going to have to pick up a new weapon or you're going to be back to your basic weapon. Now, the basic weapon is not very effective against the more powerful enemies, sure, but it's certainly not some ultra-pathetic pea shooter. You can still get work done with the basic weapon, so it's not like the basic weapon feels incredibly puny and useless. You actually feel like you can still do some damage no matter what happens to you. And if you feel like that isn't enough, then you also have a limited supply of your special weapon. Now, this is going to depend on which character you're playing, because each character has their own specific special weapon. And these can be things like basic frag grenades, as well as grenades that create a wall of flames, or rocket launchers, or heat seekers, or things like that that do quite a lot of damage and are pretty much vital for going up against the bosses with. These have a very limited ammunition supply that you can replenish by simply finding various pickups in the world or by actually respawning. Now, of course, respawning means that you use up a credit, which in the arcades meant you were feeding more quarters into the machine. That's not the case on a home console system, so you're not getting quite the same experience with the home console version that you would on an actual arcade machine. And like I say with every game that was originally released as an arcade title, you really do need to at least play it once on a proper arcade machine to get the full effect. Because getting better at this game basically meant having to spend less quarters to be able to actually win. Now that said, unlike other games like, say, Metal Slug, where you died in one hit, here you can take multiple hits before going down, and if you select the team battle option, then you can actually select up to 3 characters that you can switch between with the press of a button. This also means you have access to all of their special weapons, which is definitely pretty handy in a lot of different situations. This means that you can get quite a lot of damage in before you actually have to use a credit to respawn. It makes the game a lot more accessible to newer players who maybe aren't used to the higher difficulty of these old arcade games, and thus they end up getting their ass handed to them. Well, you can switch on the team battle mode and switch between the characters and just get a feel for how it works. And that accessibility is definitely a plus because this is not an easy game by any stretch of the imagination. You do need to learn the timings on being able to dodge projectiles. You do need to learn when to shoot in one direction versus shooting in another direction. You need to learn when to use your special weapon and when not to use it. And if you don't get better at the game, you're going to be spending quite a lot of credits on being able to continue playing it. Like a lot of arcade games, this was designed to eat up quarters, and that means that there's going to be a lot of situations where there's a massive amount of projectiles coming at you, and you can't necessarily see the way you're actually supposed to dodge them. Luckily, because you can take several hits before going down, it doesn't feel anywhere near as BS as in, say, Metal Slug, but it's definitely something you have to get used to and something you have to learn how to play. And even when you do learn how to play, it's going to take quite a bit of practice before you get everything down. Now that said, if you are pretty good at the game, or you do have infinite continues like people do on home consoles, then you're going to find the game's actually pretty short. It's right around 30 minutes long on a single playthrough. That said, there are 3 different routes that you can take throughout the course of the game to have a bunch of different stages. There's a mountain, a valley, and a jungle route. And even if they don't necessarily vary up the gameplay all that much, they do vary up the locales and make things a bit more interesting. That said, some of the weaker points of the design definitely come through when you take a look at all 3 routes. For example, the boss fights are going to be basically the exact same fights over and over and over again, regardless of which route you take. You're also going to be running into the same basic enemies throughout the entire game, so that might get a bit repetitive for you. They do try to spice up things here and there. For example, there's one sequence where you're on a motorcycle, but those sorts of sequences are rather short and fairly few and far between throughout the entirety of the game. The last couple of levels and the story are all going to be the same no matter which route you take as well, and things don't really change depending on which character you pick either, other than the gameplay implications of each character having a different special weapon. So really the game relies almost exclusively on its core gameplay loop, and it's a good thing that as a top-down arcade-style run-and-gun shooter, it actually is a really good game. While they take a bit of getting used to considering how the aiming and shooting works, the controls actually end up working very well in the game's favor. Moving and shooting feels pretty natural for the most part, and that dodge mechanic also makes avoiding projectiles surprisingly fluid. The thing is that you do have to get used to those controls because they don't really control like what you're used to in an arcade shooter these days. Most arcade style shooters these days actually are twin stick designs, so you aim with one stick and you move with the other. Here it's all with one stick. And if you start shooting and just hold the button down, then it's actually going to keep shooting in the direction that you originally shot, but you can now start strafing around. And once you get used to how that works, it's actually pretty intuitive. The thing is, there is going to be that adjustment period where you feel like it's a bit clunky. There is also the matter of you're probably not going to play all of the characters in this game. Some of them just have flat out better special weapons than others, so you're going to gravitate towards those. And those are basically the ones with the various rocket launchers. The main reason for that is that it's just a lot easier to hit stuff with the rocket launchers than it is to hit things with the grenades. So the game's definitely not perfect, but for what it is, which is a classic arcade run-and-gun shooter that's from a top-down perspective, it's one of the better ones out there. If you're into the genre, you'll definitely be able to get quite a bit out of it, but if you're not into the genre, it may be a bit hit or miss for you. It just depends on how much you're willing to put up with the fact that it is an old arcade game, and those are just a completely different design philosophy than modern games are. If you understand and accept that context, then you'll probably be able to enjoy this game quite a bit. But if you're the kind of modern gamer that only plays games that are pathetically easy, then you'll probably think that this is way too hard, that it's BS, blah blah blah. But the fact of the matter is that it's a classic run-and-gun arcade shooter that still holds up pretty well to this day, and I can very easily recommend it, at least if that's your kind of thing. Thanks for watching.